Did you know that you can create up to 14 mid-control points on a curve? So, if levels were as powerful as curves, they would have all those 14 sliders between their black and white sliders, right? Now imagine, if you want to move the center midtone slider to the left or right, how far could you go? Hey, welcome back. My name is Sid. Today we'll understand the logic behind curves to use its full potential in Photoshop, and stick around till the end to see one of the fastest and the most efficient technique to use curves. So the standard representation of curves is based on the histogram, which has a total of 256 brightness values, ranging from 0 being pure black to 255 being pure white, and 128 being the middle gray point. Understanding a histogram in this instance can be very useful to instantly determine how the image is exposed, so I highly recommend you to watch this small video tutorial to correctly read a histogram. Unlike histogram or levels, which are one-dimensional or linear, the curve is designed in the two-dimensional space. This black and white gradient bar in the horizontal axis represents the input values from 0 to 255, with 0 being black, 128 gray, and 255 white. Once you memorize this brightness scale, you can easily take a calculated guess with the brightness values. Similarly, the black and white gradient bar in the vertical axis represents the output values from 0 at the bottom to 255 on the top, which is white. This diagonal baseline represents the tonal range and corresponds to the horizontal and the vertical brightness scale values. That's why the control point of the white point is situated in the topmost right corner and not at the bottom right like in levels. Before we deep dive into curves, let's understand the difference between levels and curves. So levels is a simplified version of curves. Think of it as a bicycle with training wheels on both sides. Curves, on the other hand, is like a racing bike with multiple gears. Instead of speed control like in the bikes, here we deal with the control of tones, especially in the midtones. Curves will give you a lot more possibilities with the midtone control points compared to levels. So let's start with the similarities first. So in levels, what we have here is the tonal range of the image with the black slider on the left side that helps you set the black point of your image, and the white slider on the right side which helps you set the white point. In curves, we have a similar black point control slider on the left side that helps you set the black point of your image, and on the right side, we have the white point slider which sets the white point. You can also directly move these control points just by clicking on them and then dragging. Notice how the sliders also move when you do this? And back in levels, below we have the output levels which dictates the intensity of the black points and the white points. Moving them inwards will fade them ranging from a scale from 0 to 255, where 0 is pure black, 255 is pure white, and 128 is the middle gray point. So if both the sliders are at the center gray point, what you get is a flat gray image. And if you go all the way to the opposite ends, the black point will turn into white and the white point to black, and what you're left with is an inverted image. Similarly in curves, the vertical brightness scale controls the intensity of the black and white control points, but unlike the designated black and white control point sliders on the horizontal scale, there are no sliders on the vertical scale, so you have to click and drag them up or down. So the intensity of the black control point, which is situated at the bottom left corner of the diagonal, can be faded by dragging it up the vertical brightness scale. And the white control point, which is situated on the top right corner of the diagonal, can be dragged down the vertical brightness scale to fade the whites. When I reach the brightness output level of 128, which is mid-gray, and do the same for the black point and move it all the way to the middle, I basically have a flat line, resulting in the same gray image we saw in levels. Now, if I were to keep going all the way to the opposite end, I get an inverted image just like in levels. So far, levels and curves are identical. Now, let's reset them both using the reset icon and see what really makes them different. So in levels adjustment, we have a single midtone slider to adjust the midtone contrast. It moves the midtone level which has the value 128. Here it shows the value 1 because it also doubles up as a gamma control slider like you might have seen in the exposure adjustment layer, which also works the same way. So if I move it left, it brightens the midtones, and if I move it right, it darkens the midtones. Now let's open up the curves adjustment layer. This diagonal baseline represents the tonal range of the image, with the bottom left corner being the black point and the top right corner being the white point. The brightness scale doesn't have any midpoints, but you can create up to 14 control points on the diagonal, which corresponds to the brightness scale below. So if I put a control point in the middle and set the brightness level of exactly 128, it is equivalent to the midtone slider in levels. And just like in levels, if I move it left, it brightens the midtones, and if I move it right, it darkens the midtones. The biggest and the only difference between levels and curves is that in curves, besides the two corner points, we can create up to 14 mid-control points, not only in the RGB composite channel, but in every individual color channel. It's important where you place a point, as this determines which part of the tonal range you want to alter. The control points towards the bottom left of the diagonal will target the shadows, and around the center of the line will target the midtones, and towards the top will target the highlights. Each mid-control point is designed to move upwards or downwards to brighten or darken. Up is for brightening and down is for darkening. And this is why curve's tonal range is a diagonal instead of horizontal like in levels. Imagine if levels, which is one-dimensional or has a linear layout, had 14 mid-control sliders. If you want to make one of the mid-control points lighter or darker, you would have to push it to the left or right, and it would just clash with all the other sliders. So that's why the layout of curves is two-dimensional, so the control points can move freely vertically on the y-axis without clashing into each other. And including the black and white corner points in the end, we have a total of 16 control points on the diagonal. But the reason why curves is powerful is not because you have so many control points over levels. Most of the time you need less than 5 points for corrections. The extra mid-control points enables you to control the shadow, midtones and the highlights independently of both tone and the color channels, which is not possible in levels. And if you have a casual habit of using levels for one thing, brightness contrast for some other thing, and color balance for a third thing, your thought process gets scattered. Curves on the other hand can handle all the adjustments of levels, brightness contrast, exposure, color balance, photo filters and channel mixer combined and can still achieve much more. Once you understand the few basic concepts of curves, they are so easy to use. So let's dive deeper into curves to see how they work. You might come across two layouts of the curves panel depending on how you activate it. If you invoke curves using the shortcut Ctrl or Command M or access it via the Pro Workflow panel, you get this layout, which has all the display options on the right and some tools on the left and below the curves. When I click OK, you get the same curves in the Properties tab, which has a slightly different layout, and this is the same layout that you will get if you access it via the Curves Adjustment Layer icon. So the display options here can be accessed from the top right corner of the Properties tab and clicking on the Curves Display option. But for the options section of this tutorial, I'll switch back to the other curves layout which is more interactive. So the first display option is the Show Amount Of, which has the option Light, which ranges from 0 to 255 brightness levels. This is the standard brightness scale to evaluate exposure and tone in RGB images. The other option is Pigment or Ink, which inverts the curve display, and the output values here are expressed in percentage. This option mainly deals with prepping CMYK images for printing, so unless you have a specific reason to change it, leave it on the default option of Light. Below you have two grid sizes to choose from. You can change from quarters to 1/10 by alternating the grid size icon. You can also Alt or Option click directly on the grid to toggle between them. In the Show options, you first have the channel overlay. This shows you a preview of the individual red, green and blue channels in the RGB composite channel. It is very useful to keep an eye on all other channels to see if you have made any adjustments in them. You can't modify them in the RGB composite channel, only preview them. Another important part of the curves is the view of the histogram of the image displayed right behind the grid. The histogram can be turned off or on in this viewing option. So if you don't see the histogram, make sure you have this histogram checkbox ticked. Next is the diagonal baseline viewing option, which shows the default place of the curve as a straight diagonal line before it was modified. The intersection lines are the helping vertical and horizontal intersecting lines that appear on the cursor when you're dragging a control point. They let us see where the point is relative to the grid and also helps us align or move in straight lines. Since there is no direct reset button in this particular layout, to reset the curve you have to hold the Alt or Option key and the cancel button will become the reset button. And the same curve in the Properties layout, you have the direct access to the reset icon, which will reset the curves to default. And you will notice some extra icons here. The eye icon is for toggling the layer view on and off. And this other icon is to hold for preview. The preview stays off as long as you're pressing it down. This next icon here is for clipping the adjustment layer to the layer below, so it will affect only the underlying layer. Let me show you. If I make a selection and copy it to the new layer, and I want my curves to affect only this layer, I can either click on this icon to clip it and click on this icon again to unclip it, or I can place the cursor right between the two layers, hold Alt or Option to get the clipping mask icon and then click to clip or unclip it back again. Now let's get rid of these layers and open a new curve to see how to use a curve. The most basic use of curves is to create contrast. Contrast is nothing but making the brights brighter and the darks darker. The S-curve is probably one of the most common ways for you to create contrast with curves. Click a point anywhere in the shadow region, which is between 0 that is pure black and 128 which is mid-gray, and drag it down to darken the shadows. You don't even need to drag the point. Instead, You can click to create a point and then use the up and down arrow keys to move them. You can hold the shift key to move faster or Alt or Option to move slower. The other shortcut to move the control point up or down in a straight line is to click in the output box and scroll up and down to change the values. Holding shift and Alt or Option also changes the scrolling speed. Now click a point in the highlights region, which is between 128 mid-gray to 255, which is white, and drag it up. This will brighten up the highlights and increase the contrast. And if I add another control point in the middle to pin the midtones, I can independently control the highlights and the shadows of the image. If you want to control the image more, just add more control points. And it's really important for you to know that when you're correcting an image, be very careful not to drag two adjacent control points too far away from each other, as this might create posterization or psychedelic effects. And to remove these control points, you can simply select them. You can tell it's selected because the hollow points get filled with white when it's active, and you can either delete them using your keyboard or swiftly drag it off the curve. You can also control or command click on the control point. And if you find that difficult or want to target a specific area, Curves also has this user-friendly targeted adjustment tool, which is this up and down hand or finger scrub icon. When you hover any part of the image, you get this eyedropper cursor, which shows you the exact pixel position on the curve. So you can see the highlight areas will be on the top half of the curve, and when we go to the dark areas, they will always be below the midpoint. And simply click over the specific area you want to fine-tune and slide the cursor up to brighten or down to darken. And you can see the pixel position on the diagonal line and how the curve is being modified. You can also reduce the contrast to create the popular matte effect or the faded effect. To reduce contrast is to make the brights and the darks dull or flat by pushing them towards gray. So if I move the black point slider from 0 to say 35, what I'm telling Photoshop is that instead of the darkest pixels to be pure black, which is represented by the value 0, I want it at 35 on the vertical brightness scale, which is this slightly faded black. So the darkest my dark pixels can ever get is the value 35. Similarly, you can also do the same with the white point by dragging it down the vertical brightness scale to make it dull. You might have noticed that as we move a control point, the input and output values also change below. So what are these input and output values? The interesting part is that there are two ways to understand the input and output values. First is that they are the actual coordinates on this graph. We can see the exact position of the control points in the input and output box below. The horizontal brightness scale represents the input levels. So the x-axis coordinate of a control point is the input value, and similarly the y-axis coordinate, which corresponds to the vertical brightness scale, represents the output levels, is the output value. The other way of seeing this is like before and after values of a pixel. The original pixel brightness values is the same as the input value, and after moving the control point of that pixel vertically, the new adjusted value of that pixel is the output value. So, if you create a point on the baseline at say 90, let's keep the input and output value the same, which means that it is the unmodified or the original position of the control point. So the input value of 90 means on the horizontal brightness scale from 0 to 255, the brightness value of this particular control point is 90. And the output value of 90 also means that on the vertical output brightness scale from 0 to 255, the brightness value of this particular point also corresponds to 90. So let's say if you want to brighten it to something around 120, you can simply set the output value to 120 and it will brighten those pixels which were of 90 to a brightness value of 120. So if I click somewhere in the midpoint of the diagonal baseline, it is 128. Let's put the exact value. Now if I want the midtones, which is 128, to be completely white, I know the white value is 255. So let's put 255 in the output, and just like that all the midtones are white. If the curves gets flattened at the top, those entire range of pixels become white. Now, if I want to make the midtones black, what number should I put? 0, right? Which is pure black on the brightness scale. And just like that, all the midtones will become black. And this flat line of the curve sticking at the bottom means these entire range of pixels have become black. Now let's take it one step further. Up here we have a few presets for curves. I'm going to choose the preset negative, which will invert your image just like the invert adjustment layer does. Now, let's take a look at what is happening with the control points. This one says the input was of 0 value, which means that it was pure black, and the output is 255, that is white. So all the black pixels are now white. And the other control point had input of 255, and now the output is 0, which means the white pixels are now black. But do you notice one more thing that has changed? The colors are inverted as well, even though the color channels are not moved at all. So what does this tell us? This means that the RGB channel is not only affecting the brightness values of the pixels, but also affects the colors. It works for all three channels combined. If it was just affecting the luminosity, you should have got this look that I get when I change the blend mode to luminosity. You see the color stays the same, except the black is now white and the white is black. Interesting, right? This is an important thing to remember because when you're adjusting the brightness values of the pixels, colors are also affected. So if you wish to only affect the brightness of the image, make sure to use the luminosity blend mode. Now, the same theory applies to the individual red, green and blue channels with which we can modify the color of the image. But before we head over to the channels, it's important for you to understand the basic of additive color theory. You see, red, green and blue are additive colors, which when mixed with light like your computer screen, form the color white. And based on the modern RGB color wheel, the opposites are subtractive color CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta and yellow, which when combined create black in print. If you really want to understand this clearly, you should definitely watch this short video packed with color theory related to Photoshop. Right now, all we need to know are the complementary colors of red, green and blue, which are cyan, magenta and yellow. Also, make a note where the complementary colors meet. The color is neutral gray. This is also explained in the same color theory video. It is important to memorize that RGB is the opposite of CMY, but in case you forget, there are hints all over Photoshop. You can check in the info panel. You will find on one side is the RGB and on the opposite side by default is CMY. And if you open the color balance adjustment layer, you can see the opposite colors visually. Right now we are here in the midtones, so if I push the midtones towards red, it will increase the red and decrease the cyan. Anyway, the exact adjustments color balance is capable of is what we are about to do with the color channels in curves with even more control. So in curves, when you go to the red channel, it controls the red and its complementary color cyan. Unfortunately, Photoshop still shows us the brightness scale in the color channels instead of the color opposites. This is how the red color channel should look like. The color values here translate to 0 being cyan, 128 being mid-gray and 255 being red. Now you can apply all that we learned in the RGB composite channel over here. So the red control point is the top right corner of the diagonal with the value 255 and the cyan control point is in the bottom left corner of the diagonal with the value 0. Let's click a point somewhere in the midtones. And if we move it up on the vertical scale, it will boost the reds in the midtones, and if we pull it downwards, it will decrease the reds and at the same time increase the cyan. If you want the highlights of your image to be more red, simply click on a point near the highlights area which is on the top right and pull it up. And if you want to remove the reds or add cyan in the shadows, click a point in the bottom left of the curve and pull it down. And just like in the RGB channel, you can also use the targeted adjustment or the hand slider tool in all three color channels as well. For example, in the green channel which controls green and its complementary color magenta, so instead of clicking points, you can visually click on any area and drag the tool up to increase the greens and down to remove the green and increase the magenta. Finally, in the blue channel, which controls the blue and its complementary color yellow, push the curve up to boost the blues and down for the yellows. The best way to remember which color is up and which is down is that the top half of the triangle is the same color as the name of that particular channel. So, in the red channel, the top half triangle is red. Same with the green, the top half triangle is green, and in the blue channel, the top triangle is blue. Even when you see the main RGB composite channel, the top triangle is white. Why? Because when they are combined on screen, the resulting color is white. With curves, you're not restricted to making just curves. You can also move the black and white sliders like in levels to compress the histogram and expand the dynamic range of your image. Moving the black slider to the right will shift the black point of the image, turning all the pixels to the left of the slider as pure black. So if I move the black point slider from 0 to say 35, all the pixels that had the brightness value of 35 or less become pure black. In other words, all the pixels that had the brightness level of 35, as you can see in the input box, will now be lowered or darkened to an output value of 0, which is pure black. One of the best ways to adjust tones is to hold down Alt or Option key and click and drag on one of these sliders. This will give you a clipping preview. Here's the proper technique to do this. So just by looking at the histogram, I can tell that I don't have any pure black and white pixels in the image. That means this is a low contrast image and heavy on the midtones. Of course you can see the image that looks washed out, but I know this for sure because there are gaps in the shadows and the highlights end of the histogram. And gaps means that there are no pixels present. To increase the dynamic range all the way from black to white, I'm going to move the black slider to the right. And as I move this slider, you can see the dark areas getting darker. And if I move it too far, I will force some other areas to be pure black. So I'm going to back off a bit. Now, how do I find the black values of this image? What I'm going to do is hold the Alt or Option key and drag the black slider, which will give me a preview of all those pixels in my image that are being clipped to pure black. The color pixels that you see are the preview of the clipping in red, green and blue color channels. Now here's the thing that you may not know. It is not until you start seeing pure black the pixels start clipping to pure black. So I'm going to hold down the Alt and drag the slider back until I don't see any black. There can be any other colors in there but not black. Same with whites. If I push it too far, I will force pixels to become white. So again, I'll hold the Alt or Option key and back off until I don't see any white pixels being clipped. This adjustment creates a slightly different contrast, and if required, you can combine the two to add additional contrast. So now that we have the black and white points set, I can either pin the midtone somewhere in the middle and control the shadows and the highlights independently. Now there is another way to adjust the black and white points for your image. You can also use the black eyedropper tool to select the black point from the image, which basically tells Photoshop that I want this particular shade to be pure black. Similarly, with the white eyedropper tool, you can set the white point of your image. You can simply eyeball and select your black and white points, but it won't be that accurate. So instead, you can use this amazing technique which I'll share with you. So we begin just like we did to find the black and white points earlier. That is by holding the Alt or Option key and dragging the black point slider and going past the color pixels until the black pixels start to appear, and I'll leave the black slider. Now here's the trick. Since I'm adjusting the black point, I'm going to select my black point eyedropper tool and click on the black pixels that started to appear. But if you simply go into your image, you won't know where the black pixels were. Any guesses how to do it then? One way is to keep holding the Alt or Option key and go into your image with the black point eyedropper tool to make the preview appear. Or if Curves Layout has the option to show clipping, simply check it and now click on the black point. If you're thinking that since I already set the black point via the slider, why am I doing it again with the eyedropper? Well, I'll answer this right after we set the white point the same way. So first, hold the Alt or Option key and drag the white slider until the white pixels start to appear. Then, make sure to select the white point eyedropper tool this time, and while holding the Alt or Option, click on the white pixels that appeared. So now we have set the black and the white point. Do you notice that this time the curve has not only adjusted the contrast but also color corrected the image a bit? Now here's the interesting part. Take a look at the RGB channel curve. Do you notice that it is still in its default position and yet we have the contrast of the image fixed? So what does this tell us? This tells us that the individual color channels together are also affecting the luminosity of the image, not only the color. Amazing, right? And any guesses what you can do with the gray point eyedropper tool in curves? No, it's not for selecting the midtones like you would think. The neutral gray point eyedropper tool in curves is primarily used for color or white balance correction. It allows you to choose the mid-neutral gray point of your image by balancing the color. It does not affect the tones. And that is why it's available only for RGB images, while it's disabled for grayscale images. And you can see in the image how the midtone contrast is unchanged while the curves in the red, green and blue channels are affected. Because if you remember, RGB composite channel also affects color as well. Now, I have to tell you that I have a much faster trick to color correct images using curves in Photoshop. But I won't reveal it in this video because I want you all to firstly understand how curves really work, which will enable you to become problem solvers and avoid following steps blindly. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell right now to get notified as soon as the next video releases. And if you're a working professional or an aspiring photographer, make sure to check out our Masters Retouchers pack, which is one of the most powerful and comprehensive tools we've ever created for Photoshop. So take a look at the link below and see how it can help your retouching. And until the next video, bye for now.